For years, warhawks in Washington and Tel Aviv have fantasized over the possibility of waging a broad regional war against all of the independent governments in the Middle East, especially Iran. And it appears that that day has arrived. The United States and Israel are at war with numerous countries across the Middle East, including Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and of course, Palestine. Today I'm going to be talking about the very dangerous escalation in the region and the impact it will have on the rest of the world. But before that, I want to briefly tell you about an important issue that's happening. In recent weeks, there has been a wave of censorship going on, and many channels that speak out against war and empire have been censored. Their entire channel has been erased, including all of their videos. So if you want to follow our work, please consider also subscribing to our channel over at rumble.com/geopoliticaleconomy. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter on Substack over at geopoliticaleconomy.substack.com. We have linked to both of those pages in the description below. Those are places where you can follow our work just in case one day you wake up and Geopolitical Economy Report has been erased. The channel is no longer on YouTube. It's a very scary possibility considering the extreme political censorship of independent journalists and media outlets that have been reporting critically on the crimes committed by the United States and its allies. This is the very dangerous political moment we're in which independent journalists are being detained and interrogated and censored on social media by big tech overlords in Silicon Valley. So please follow us on different platforms so we don't lose contact. Now that said, let's continue with the show. On the 1st of October, Iran responded to a series of Israeli attacks on Iran and inside Iranian territory. Tehran acted in self-defense and hit Israeli military targets, launching nearly 200 missiles in what it called Operation True Promise 2. And Iran claimed that it hit numerous targets inside Israel, including an Israeli air base that was housing F-35 fighter jets provided by the United States. And Iran said that it also hit the headquarters of Israel's spy agency, Mossad. Now, many Western politicians and pundits have misleadingly portrayed this as an Iranian act of aggression against Israel. But in reality, Iran was responding to numerous acts of war carried out by Israel against Iran. In April, Israel attacked Iran's consulate in Syria, which was an act of war against Iranian sovereign territory, according to international law. And at the time, even many mainstream Western think tanks warned that this could be the spark that ignites a broader Middle East war, which is exactly what it was. And then in another Israeli act of war in July, Mossad assassinated the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, in Iranian territory. And then this September, Israel also assassinated a top Iranian general, Abbas Nilfurushan, in Israel's attacks in Lebanon, in Beirut. So it was inevitable that Iran was going to respond to these Israeli acts of war after Israel repeatedly attacked Iranian territory and assassinated Iranian officials. Now, what's funny about this Iranian attack is the contradictory Western narrative, because after US President Joe Biden claimed that the US helped Israel to defeat what he said was an ineffective Iranian attack, Biden claimed, quote, "The attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective, and this is testament to Israeli military capability and the US military. It's also a testament to intensive planning between the United States and Israel," end quote. And then Biden insisted that the US is, quote, fully supportive of Israel, end quote, repeating the word fully 3 times. I don't know how something can be full 3 times, but Biden also added that the US government is, quote, in constant contact, end quote, with the Israeli government, planning operations together. Now, what's funny about this narrative is that the US and Israel constantly claim that Iran is this big threat to the entire world, and they have to wage war on Iran and overthrow the Iranian government. But then they also say, oh, actually, Iran's not a threat. When Iran acted in self-defense and responded to Israel's attacks, Iran actually didn't hit any targets, they claim. They say Iran is actually weak. So which one is it? Is Iran this big, bad, evil boogeyman who's supposedly threatening everyone? Or is Iran weak and then the US and Israel can do whatever they want and face no consequences? It's a contradictory narrative. In fact, the US government constantly says that it must continue sending tens of billions of dollars of military support to Israel in order to, quote, ensure Israel's qualitative military edge, end quote, as is so often said by the US government. It's qualitative military edge. The US says Israel must have much better military technology than all of the other countries in the region. But if Israel is so strong and no one can ever touch it and it has the Iron Dome system, then why are we supposed to be afraid of Iran? Why are we supposed to be afraid of relatively smaller groups like Hezbollah? It shows that propagandists in Western governments and the Western media want to have their cake and eat it too. And this kind of hypocritical propaganda is especially clear when you look at Western media reporting on Israel's horrific war in Gaza, in which tens of thousands of civilians have been killed by Israel in the past year of brutal bombing using US bombs, US missiles, US artillery, US planes. Or if you look at the media reporting now on Israel's invasion of Lebanon and its bombing of Lebanon, you constantly read these headlines where they talk about Lebanon airstrikes, not mentioning that it's Israel launching those airstrikes on Lebanon. But then you compare headlines in those same media outlets about Iran's self-defense response to Israel, and they say Iran launches ballistic missiles against Israel. So there's a clear double standard. It's so obvious. And you can also see these double standards if you look at a chart showing the number of cross-border attacks in the past year between Israel and Lebanon. You can clearly see that Israel is responsible for the vast, vast majority of attacks. Every single month, Israel has attacked Lebanon several times more than Lebanese resistance groups have launched attacks inside Israel. But the Western media, echoing Western governments, claims that Israel is supposedly defending itself. And now top ministers in the Israeli regime are openly saying that they want to reoccupy and colonize southern Lebanon, which is exactly what Israel did in the 1980s and 90s, which is, by the way, conveniently left out of the majority of the discussion of what's happening today. There's this historical amnesia. But let me briefly review a timeline that was published by Reuters, a very mainstream Western media outlet. It notes that Israel has a long history of incursions and invasions in Lebanon. Let's go through some of this history. In 1948, when Israel was founded through the mass ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians, then Israel began waging war against all of its neighbors, including Lebanon. In 1968, Israel destroyed a dozen passenger planes at the airport in Beirut. In 1973, Israeli special forces shot dead Palestinians in Beirut, and Israel launched attacks on targets in Lebanon. In 1978, Israel invaded South Lebanon and set up a narrow occupation zone. In 1982, Israel again invaded Lebanon, all the way to the capital, Beirut. And then in 1985, Israel established a formal occupation zone in southern Lebanon that continued for 15 years. And armed groups like Hezbollah emerged as resistance against Israel's illegal military occupation of South Lebanon, this colonial occupation. Hezbollah would not exist if Israel had not invaded and occupied South Lebanon. And then in 2000, Israel was forced out after 20 years of indigenous resistance. But in 2006, Israel launched another war, another invasion of Lebanon, and brutal airstrikes that destroyed major parts of cities in Lebanon. And now in 2024, Israel is once again invading Lebanon with the full support of the United States, including President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump. All of them are strongly supporting Israel as it's carrying out another colonial invasion and occupation. And now the US military is sending thousands more troops to the Middle East in order to protect Israel. And by the way, a better term for the Middle East is West Asia. Middle East is a very Eurocentric term because it's only middle compared to Europe. The Middle East is actually the western part of Asia. But anyway, the point is that the Pentagon announced that it's sending thousands more troops to the region to defend Israel. And that means that there are 43,000 US troops in the region. 43,000. The US has been at war in this region for decades, for my entire life, invading Iraq, attacking Syria, attacking Libya, attacking Yemen. And now the US continues to expand its colonial footprint, its chokehold on this region. I already discussed how when Iran struck Israel on the 1st of October, it was an act of self-defense in response to numerous Israeli attacks on Iranian soil and against Iranian officials. But when the US Defense Department published a statement on this attack, it erased all of that context. And instead, the Pentagon press secretary boasted that, quote, the US military coordinated closely with the Israeli Defense Forces to help defend Israel, end quote. And the Pentagon revealed that the US military deployed 2 destroyers to the Eastern Mediterranean, which fired a dozen interceptors, costing millions of dollars, by the way, at incoming Iranian ballistic missiles as part of defending Israel. Although what's funny is the Pentagon acknowledged that it's unknown if those US interceptors actually took down any of the Iranian missiles. But in this statement, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who was until recently a member of the board of directors of the weapons corporation Raytheon, he boasted in this statement that the United States has an ironclad commitment to the defense of Israel. Ironclad commitment. So the Pentagon kept claiming that Israel is defending itself, erasing all of the context of the Israeli acts of war against Iran. And now the US government is helping Israel prepare for an attack on Iran. President Biden revealed that they're making plans to attack Iran's oil infrastructure, which, by the way, is an attack on civilian infrastructure. This to me says everything because Iran made it very clear in its attack that it only went after military targets in Israel, attacking Israeli military bases and Mossad. Iran intentionally did not want to hit any civilian targets. So what's the response of the US and Israel? Let's hit civilian targets in Iran. Let's hit the oil infrastructure, a civilian target. To me, this says everything about how the Western narrative about Iran and its allies in the region is the polar inversion of reality. It's the US and Israel that are constantly attacking civilians. And Israel boasts of the tens of thousands of Palestinians it has killed in Gaza. But when Iran responded to Israel in self-defense, Israeli regime officials and propagandists said, look, Iran didn't kill a single Israeli. We're amazing. Iran didn't kill any of our people. But Iran does not judge the effectiveness of its attacks based on the number of civilians it kills. Iran doesn't want to kill Israeli civilians. It wants to hit Israeli military targets. So the US and Israel are making it very clear which is the so-called civilized side. And by the way, I should also point out that after Biden made this threat of attacking Iranian oil infrastructure, what happened? The price of oil in the global market shot up by 5% because Iran is the world's 7th largest oil producer, and the price of oil in the global market is determined largely by speculators. And if they think that there could be a shortage in oil supply, even if there's not actually a shortage in oil supply, even if it's only expectations, prices move based on expectations, not necessarily based on reality. So prices immediately went up, expecting a shortage of oil because of the US-Israeli attacks on Iran's oil supplies that are being planned. And this is, of course, happening just a few weeks before the November elections in the United States, which means that if oil prices continue to rise over this US-Israeli regional war, this means that gas prices in the United States will likely go up a few days before the election, which is going to hurt Joe Biden and his vice president, Kamala Harris, who's running, and probably help Donald Trump. I mean, this is crazy. I believe they refer to this as a self-own. But it shows that these US politicians like Joe Biden are so obsessively committed to war, to trying to expand the power of the US empire around the world, that they're willing to do damage to their own presidential campaign, or at least the presidential campaign of their allies, of their party, in order to expand the power of the US empire and to prop up imperial protectorates like Israel, which is an extension of the US empire, or as the former US Secretary of State Alexander Haig said in the Reagan era, Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US empire. Or as Biden himself has said for decades, if Israel didn't exist, the US would have to create Israel.
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one. I've long said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
Now, there are some people who argue that the US doesn't want to expand this regional war and that Israel is dragging the US into a new war. I think that's completely wrong. That's the narrative that the Biden administration is trying to craft. The Biden administration is using some of its loyal stenographers in the media to claim we want peace and a ceasefire, but it's big bad Benjamin Netanyahu who is just pushing for more and more war. But in reality, there are so many reports showing that the Biden administration has been encouraging Israel, pushing Israel to expand this war. Politico revealed this in an article titled, US Officials Quietly Backed Israel's Military Push Against Hezbollah. This article notes that, quote, senior White House figures privately told Israel that the US would support its decision to ramp up military pressure against Hezbollah, even as the Biden administration publicly urged the Israeli government in recent weeks to curtail its strikes, end quote. So the Biden administration publicly is saying one thing, whereas privately it's doing the exact opposite. Publicly, Biden claims we want peace, but privately, the Biden administration tells Israel, invade Lebanon, do it, go, you have a green light. As this article in Politico reveals, top White House officials told top Israeli officials that the US agreed with Netanyahu's broad strategy to shift Israel's military focus to the north in Lebanon. This ridiculous, cynical narrative that the Biden administration supposedly wants peace, but it's just Israel standing in the way, was contradicted by the US State Department spokesman and inadvertent Count Dracula impersonator Matthew Miller. He was asked by a journalist if the US wanted a ceasefire and a diplomatic resolution, and he said that the US refuses to have a diplomatic resolution with Hamas, which means it refuses to actually have a ceasefire, because you can't have a ceasefire if you don't have a diplomatic resolution with one side of the war. By definition, in a ceasefire, both or all sides of a war have to come to the negotiating table. If one side isn't invited, there's no ceasefire. Here's this revealing clip.
We continue to engage with Israel about, when it comes to Lebanon, is ensuring that they have the ability to attack terrorist targets, terrorist infrastructure, a terrorist organization, but ultimately we want to see a diplomatic resolution.
Well, was that the case with Rafah, for instance? Not just in Rafah, but
we've never wanted to see a diplomatic resolution with Hamas.
Well, okay. Well, what about the ceasefire?
We wanted to see a ceasefire, but we have always been committed. We have always been committed to the destruction of Hamas. And I wish that Hamas would come to the table and work with us on a ceasefire.
So it's the US that doesn't want peace, but Biden says, oh, it's Netanyahu and I can't do anything and my hands are tied, which makes people think absurdly that Israel is the tail wagging the dog. But actually what that does is it is an excuse for the US empire's crimes. It distracts from the culpability of the US empire, which didn't need Israel to invade Vietnam and kill millions of people in Vietnam, or wage war on Korea, or wage war against former Yugoslavia, or wage war all around the world. Israel is the convenient excuse that the US uses to try to expand its hegemony across West Asia. Because we know that war hawks in Washington have dreamed about a war on Iran for decades, ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when the Iranian people rose up and overthrew the US-backed dictator, the Shah, who had governed Iran with an iron fist on behalf, largely, of the United States. When the US State Department considered Iran under the Shah to be one of what it called the twin pillars. That was the US strategy for West Asia. The Western pillar was Saudi Arabia, and the Eastern pillar was Iran. And the US used those regimes to try to maintain control over the region. But with the 79 revolution, the Iranian pillar collapsed, and the US lost one of its most important imperial protectorates in the region, which also was another reason why Israel became so important for the US empire. Israel is the unsinkable aircraft carrier that the US uses to try to wage war against all of the anti-colonialist forces in the region, whether it's the Palestinians, the Iranians, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Yemenis. The US has used Israel as its attack dog to go after them. And this was spelled out very clearly in a report published in 2009 by the powerful Washington-based think tank, the Brookings Institution. And the researcher Brian Beletic first reported on this. He did great research looking at this report, which discusses a new American strategy toward Iran. And this report was written by numerous veterans of the CIA, including Kenneth Pollock and Bruce Riedel, who were officials involved in the US Central Intelligence Agency, making plans to try to destabilize Iran. In this document, the CIA veterans wrote that the United States could encourage and even assist Israel in conducting strikes on Iran, and they said that this would be, quote, in the expectation that both international criticism and Iranian retaliation would be deflected away from the United States and onto Israel, end quote. This is a bombshell quote, revealing that powerful policymakers in Washington, CIA veterans, wanted to try to use Israel to carry out attacks on Iran that would benefit the US empire, but the US would not appear to be behind the attacks. Instead, it would be Israel on the surface. This is exactly why Joe Biden has said for decades that if Israel did not exist, the United States would have to create it, because it serves this key strategic role. The US can use Israel to wage war against any independent country in West Asia that tries to resist the US empire. And in fact, it's not just in West Asia. The US has also used this strategy in Latin America. In the 1970s, there were revolutions going on against US-backed right-wing dictatorships in Nicaragua and in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras. But these dictatorships were carrying out horrific atrocities, especially against indigenous peoples. So under international pressure, the Jimmy Carter administration, the Democrat, in 1977, formally claimed that it cut off military aid to the Guatemalan military dictatorship. So what happened? Instead, the CIA used Israel to send weapons to the military dictatorship in Guatemala. And then they did the exact same thing in Nicaragua. In 1978, the Carter administration claimed that it cut off arms shipments to the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. So Israel stepped in on behalf of the US empire, and Israel began to supply weapons to the Somoza regime, this military dictator, as he carried out horrific atrocities and killed large numbers of civilians in Nicaragua to try to crush the Sandinista revolution, although ultimately he failed. And in 1979, the Socialist Sandinista Front took power and overthrew the US-backed puppet dictatorship. This shows how the US empire has used Israel as its attack dog in many regions of the world to go after any leftist, revolutionary, anti-imperialist forces that challenge US hegemony and US corporations, whether they're communists or Arab nationalists, or even nationalist Islamic-oriented groups like in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a Shia liberation theology group that combines a revolutionary form of Islam with nationalism, fighting to defend their national sovereignty. And by the way, this is exactly what we've been seeing with this latest Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Israel is not only killing members of Hezbollah, well, and of course many civilians in Lebanon are being killed, but it's not only targeting members of Hezbollah. Israel has also been assassinating other leaders of anti-imperialist movements, including Israel assassinated numerous leaders of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, which is a Marxist revolutionary Palestinian group that was founded to try to liberate Palestine against Israeli colonialism and after the Israeli ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. This group, the PFLP, is not an Islamist group, but Israel is still killing them because they're revolutionaries who are anti-imperialists, who are against both Israeli colonialism and US imperialism. So the US empire uses Israel, this crazy attack dog run by these fascist maniacs, to try to eliminate all of the revolutionary forces in the region, to try to install obedient puppet regimes like the monarchy of Jordan, which just obediently does whatever the US tells it to do. And now the US and Israel are expanding this war across the region. So while Israel has been brutally bombing Gaza, thanks to tens of billions of dollars of support and weaponry provided by the United States, and now Israel is also invading Lebanon, well, meanwhile, Israel is bombing Yemen and bombing Syria. And Israel has already launched airstrikes in Syria's capital, Damascus. And of course, this comes after a decade-long proxy war in which the US backed Salafi jihadist extremist groups, these Contra death squads in Syria that were allied with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and were trying to overthrow the Syrian government. Of course, Israel also played a role in this. So they've continued expanding this war. And what's especially dangerous about this strategy is that the US and Israel are also threatening Russia, because Russia has been allies with Syria and Iran. And there are reports that Israel even struck near a Russian airbase that houses weapons in Syria. There have been conflicting reports about this. Some people said that Israel directly struck the Russian airbase. Some media outlets claimed that instead Israel actually hit a Russian warehouse that was storing weapons in Syria. But the point is that the US and Israel are recklessly expanding this war, which threatens to continue destabilizing the region and bringing in other major powers. And now Israel is repeatedly bombing Yemen as well, which is another country where the US has been backing war for decades, really since 9/11 with the drone war. And then in the past decade, there was another brutal war in Yemen. Hundreds of thousands of Yemenis were killed in this US-backed Saudi war, in which the US was helping Saudi Arabia relentlessly bomb civilian areas in Yemen, just like the US has been helping Israel bomb civilian areas in Gaza. The war in Yemen was very much a US-Saudi war, just like the war on Gaza and the war in Lebanon and the war against Iran are US-Israeli wars. Washington is behind all of these disastrous, catastrophic wars in the region that have caused millions of deaths. Scholars at Brown University, an Ivy League school in the US, estimated that 4.5 to 4.7 million people died due to the US-led wars following September 11, 2001. 4.5 million people at least dead in these US-led wars. And that's a conservative estimate, by the way. And furthermore, 38 million people were displaced in these US-led wars. And now the US and Israel are expanding those wars further. How many millions of people need to die? And how many tens of millions of people need to lose their homes so the US empire can try to maintain its chokehold on the world? But before I conclude here, there is another very important detail that I want to talk about, which is the role of the Persian Gulf monarchies. Because one of the reasons that the US has been so strongly pro-Israel, especially recently, is because the US has been losing its control over this extremely important region, which of course has deep geostrategic significance, connecting Asia to the Mediterranean into Europe. It also it happens to be the home to some of the world's largest oil and gas producers, and it has numerous geostrategic choke points like the Suez Canal and also the Strait of Hormuz. But in addition to all of that, what we've seen is with the rise of China economically, more and more countries in the region actually are looking to the east, to China and even Russia. China has become the largest trading partner of many countries in the region, including the Gulf monarchies. And now these Persian Gulf monarchies that have historically been close US allies are trying to be non-aligned and neutral. And they have said very clearly that in this US-Israeli war on Iran and its allies in the region, they're not going to get involved. They're going to be neutral. Reuters reported this October that, quote, Gulf Arab states sought to reassure Iran of their neutrality in the conflict between Tehran and Israel in meetings in Doha. And they made similar statements back in April when Israel attacked Iran's consulate in Syria, leading to Iran's counterattack in self-defense against Israel. In response to that, the Gulf monarchies said that they do not want the United States to use their territory in order to launch attacks on Iran. I'm reading here from an April report in Middle East Eye, quote, Gulf monarchies are urging the U.S. not to use American military bases on their territories to strike in response to any potential Iranian attack on Israel, end quote. This included Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, and Kuwait. The article added that, quote, they are also moving to prevent U.S. warplanes from flying over their airspace in the event the U.S. conducts a retaliatory strike on Iran, end quote. So I think this is the most interesting note to end on, and it's a slightly optimistic note, that many countries in the region that have historically essentially been U.S. client regimes, that historically obediently did whatever Washington wanted them to do, they're now at least being neutral. Now, of course, it would be better if they were actually to oppose Israeli colonialism, if they actually supported the Palestinian people and their struggle for equal rights, for sovereignty, if they actually supported the Lebanese people and the Yemeni people and their struggle to defend their sovereignty against Israeli colonialism and US imperialism. That would be the best scenario. But in the world we're living in, of course, being realistic, it's at least still positive to see that countries that have historically been US proxy regimes are now standing up and saying, we're neutral. We're not going to go along with the US and Israel. And this also shows that Washington's strategy to pressure the Gulf monarchies to all normalize relations with Israeli colonialism has failed completely. Saudi Arabia was on the verge of normalizing relations with Israel and no longer is. At least it says, Saudi Arabia claims that it will not normalize relations with Israel until a Palestinian state is established. And the Israeli regime, Netanyahu himself, has made it very clear there will never be a Palestinian state. So if Saudi Arabia doesn't violate its promise, which it could, but if it keeps to its word, it will not normalize relations with Israel. And what this shows is that these countries are trying to pursue a more non-aligned policy, largely because, as I said, the rise of China has opened all of this space that allows countries that historically have been obedient proxies of the West instead to have more breathing room and to pursue a more independent foreign policy. China is now the largest trading partner of many of these countries in the region, so they have alternatives. They're no longer reliant on simply exporting all of their oil to the US, so if they go against the US and they lose this massive market, they can export it all to China. They can trade with Russia, with India, with the growing global South economies, Indonesia, Vietnam. There are many other countries that are growing rapidly, and the Western powers, the US in particular, does still have a powerful military, but the West's economic power is declining increasingly, while the global South, the BRICS countries, its economic power is increasing, and that trend is only going to continue. It's something that I talk about a lot here at Geopolitical Economy Report, but this has already been long enough. I'm going to leave that for another analysis today. So on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I'm Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. If you like the work that we do, please share this. Please like, please subscribe. And as I said earlier, there's been a lot of growing political censorship. We're afraid that we could be one of the next targets due to our independent views and our opposition to war and empire. So please also consider subscribing to us on other platforms like Substack and Rumble and other websites. I have linked to those in the description below. We will be back soon for much more reporting and original analysis. See you all next time.